Hey everybody, how's it going? It is time for another squad discussion video. I've done videos talking about what new players should get, what you shouldn't be developing anymore, and I have the free-to-play farming guide, of course, which I'm having a new one come out soon. But that got me thinking. There are some good teams that they're not teams you don't want to farm. They're teams you do want to have, but as a newer player, you should really delay them. So that's what we're going to be talking about. 8 teams that you really should put off for probably at least a year as a new player. So like early game is a flexible term. Like you might think you're early game and you're like 2 years in or something. So I'm not necessarily talking to you, but in my new guide, I have, I don't know, 9, 10 teams to prioritize ahead of these. So without further ado, let's get into what they are. And the first team to talk about in my mind is the General Grievous Droids team. Now this is a very strong team, especially in territory wars. Mid game is going to be super solid. But from a new player standpoint, considering like the whole game, I'm kind of moving away from Malevolence being the recommended first like mid-tier fleet and going towards Negotiator. So without that, there's not as much of a compulsion or a compelling reason to farm General Grievous and his droids. Aside from B2, they don't really fit in anywhere else aside on the team. And well, it is a pretty strong team, and you know, you use Newt Gunray instead of Droideka in some cases, or BB-8. Well, it is a pretty strong team. You need to really develop to do really great things, like sometimes counter Jedi Master Luke Skywalker. So I do think new players should get them, but probably not until they're farming for like General Skywalker, which by virtue of this being on this list, General Skywalker is something you probably want to put off. It takes a long time. There's a lot of investment required. And even after you unlock him, you don't have his whole team ready. You have to farm the 5 first clones too. And I don't know if they're a good beginning team at this point either. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff to consider. That's why I'd put off General Grievous. If you really want to go for Malevolence, that is a reason to change things. Super solid team in that case. But there's other more pressing teams. The game's just been flooded with great teams since General Grievous got all his reworks and stuff. So yeah, that's our first candidate. Next up is a First Order team, and this is something I don't think players should work on at all until they're going for Supreme Leader Kylo Ren. And he is not my recommended first Galactic Legend anymore. If you saw my recent Galactic Legend ranking video, he was close to the bottom. And that's because raids aren't as big a thing anymore. Even in the Legacy raids where he used to be king, I think they're running it in phases. So you can't solo the whole raid with one character anymore. That was a huge part of his value. While he is fantastic on offense, on defense, he suffers and is not really going to get you many holds unless you really catch your opponent off guard. So without going for him, this team doesn't really do too much for me. I mean, they do have an Omicron First Order TIE pilot, but this is an Omicron I don't really use anymore myself. I mean, I was all about it at the beginning, and as a newer player, yes, you can make great use of it, but there's plenty of other great Omicrons for beginning players like Wampa, Savage, Treya, Captain Rex now. There's a lot of other options, so I wouldn't really bank on getting this Omicron. 2.5 years ago, it was like absolutely a, well, I disagree with it kind of at that point too, but it was a better idea to go for Supreme Lord Kylo Ren first, even though that's a super long farm. This Omicron really sweetened the deal, but put it off. There's other options, and I don't know. You if you did have the team, you either run probably Kylo Ren or First Order Executioner, and it is kind of solid. What I like about Hux is that he prevents all turn meter gain. But this is a team that has no place in like the end game meta, and then early game there are just, I don't know, 15, 20 teams that outrank it. Sith Trooper is nice. He could be an exception. You could put him somewhere else. So he's a standalone great character, and Kylo Ren Unmasked is great for his ship. Overall, as a full team, probably skip for at least more than a year. Next up, we got, and I already alluded to it, is Shock 501st clones. And that's not to say you shouldn't farm Shock T for other reasons. She could go well with Bad Batch, or just as a nice support Jedi. And maybe you want to farm 5s just for the sake of his ship. So those are all reasons for a couple of these characters. And they are pretty strong, but I don't think you want to worry about them until you start going for General Skywalker. Once you're going to be ready to get him soon, then you start working up 501st. Rex's ship is not that integral. 5's is an exception as a great ship. Echo and Arc don't have any play in ships, and when I built this team up as a newer player in 2019, 2020, they were fantastic in raids because you were able to transition from phase 1 of the Sith raid into phase 2 and ramp them up in the meantime and get a big boost in score. Or maybe it was like phase 2 to 3. It's hard to remember. But that's no longer in play anymore, and there's just better clone options for Shakti to go for. Bad Batch is way more integral to a Galactic Republic fleet, and there's not too much you're going to really punch up against. She is strong, but this team kind of requires a lot of Zetas to get running too, and that's something that newer players are having struggling with from a resource standpoint. Don't bother working on them until you have a specific plan for at least over a year. Fourth team we're going to be talking about is the Dash Scoundrels team, and it can come in a variety of forms. Most commonly, I definitely throw Quill and IG-11 in there, and Enfys Nest as kind of an annoyance. And either Beskar Mando. I like to run Hondo sometimes, and sometimes I run Beskar Mando instead of Nest. It just depends. But this team, if you do get Starkiller semi-early, within like a year or a year and a half or something, you do have Dash up and running, and that's nice. That's the start of a team. He's the leader. But it takes a lot more to get the rest going. I mean, if you went for Executor, which I don't know if that's the best idea anymore either, you would have the Mandalorian and then IG-11 and Quill farm for them, so you would be part of the way there, but I don't think you need to rush BAM really anymore. And Quill and IG-11, I mean, something unique about them, they are only two new characters post like March 2019 or something that don't require Kyber techs, which is nice. So you can get them up to gear 11 kind of faster, but it's not that strong of a team. I mean, without Honda there to prop it up, it's not like a real threat to win in the end game for me, and that's not necessarily a good corollary to say you shouldn't farm it in the early game. But it is an indication of what is possibly strong. Now, there are plenty of beginner accessible teams that are super good even in the end game, and that's kind of a measuring stick that I use. It's like, okay, does this hold up over time? Yes. And is it accessible early on? Like, it doesn't have a lot of conquest characters, doesn't have a galactic legend, it doesn't have doesn't require super high relics or stuff. If all those things are true, like think of the Treya team, that is not endgame gated at all, and it's fantastic. It's holds up really great in the endgame, so that's something you want early game. This, not quite as much. It is still a decent team to work on after you've worked on a bunch of other core teams, but for now, I'd say hold off on Dash. Actually, on one more note, I always forget to talk about Vandor when it comes to Dash because I do not have Dash's Omicron. And that's another reason I don't want to recommend this very early, because to make the most out of it, you need that Dash Omicron and then you need Vandor. Chewbacca farmed up. Vandor is not required for anything else specifically, and it's only really good if you invest in Omicron and Dash. It's not the worst Omicron in the world, but I don't have it, and I'm like 11.5 million GP, so there's plenty of other priorities, and I pretty much only do like the Grand Arena Omicrons. So I've really been putting off Dash. So just take it from me. I don't think that's another reason I don't think you should rush this really. Team number 5 that we're talking about, and this isn't this 5th worst or 5th best in this list. It's not in any particular order. But we got Sortie Droids. And there's multiple reasons why this is not a team you should rush at all, even within like 2 years. It's just a team I'm not going to be worried about building. So L3 is fantastic in her own right. She's a plug-and-play, pre-taunting light side tank, which is pretty rare. But most of the time when I use Sortie, it's with a Galactic Legend as kind of a gimmick to protect a good ally that is the weakest, which means lowest health protection. I put them under stealth all the time. But as far as her own team, she's kind of lost a step because R2-D2 for in-game players goes with Leia, and that might not be a concern if you're like a brand new player, but there's actually a compelling case for Leia to be your first or second Galactic Legend, and then Leia would go with her, and you can get that done probably within a year and a half or something. So maybe this belongs in a video of like teams you don't develop. But BB-8 is, you only have it for a complete side quest unrelated to the Sortie team. You get BB-8 if you're going for Galactic Legend Rey. That's probably the only reason to really develop BB-8. You shouldn't really be working on a Jedi Training Rey Resistance team early on. Zori, on the other hand, is a different story. And then T3 and 4, I mean, you can unlock Malak with like a gear 12 one or something, and that's more than enough for Ebon Hawk. And another reason you don't want to really work on this team is it doesn't scale down very well. Like there's plenty of teams like CLS that are have a lot of stuns, turn meter gain. They can do most of the same stuff they do at a late game level, and they also have explosives too, which is set health damage. They can do most of the same stuff they do at a late game level and fit in really well even with lower gear. Sortie droids are not really like that. Sortie relies a lot on bulk, having a really high health pool, which requires relics to get, and then T3 juices up the damage based on armor pen, which increases the higher you get to gear 13, and maybe even relics. I'm actually not sure what the mastery is. Let's see. So it's not there, but he's got some armor pen. He shares it with others, and the damage really has to scale multiplied by that all the debuffs there. But it's also a kind of Zeta intensive team if you want it to work well. So definitely put this one off. And with this next team, I'm sure I'm getting to a point where there's probably going to be some disagreement and dissension on it. Night Sisters, I don't think you should focus on early. The one compelling reason to get them is really that they have an assault battle. It's either Night Sisters or Phoenix. You can probably get away with Phoenix for several levels of that. So that's one reason you don't want to really worry about Night Sisters really early. And they are a very nice team with Marin and the right setup. They can counter Jabba the Hutt as a Galactic Legend. It's a super low win rate though, and you really need specific modding to do it. Even though like really skilled players claim it's easy and works every time, there are a lot of reasons that it's not going to work out for you. And then they counter General Grievous, which is good, but I don't know, there's not too much else. I don't really see that much value early game in them, at least as far as safe counters go. They can beat stuff like Geos, actually pretty good against the Zori Bliss team. But Marin requires Chirotex, and Omicron really helps, so it's not the worst team. I'm not going to say like don't farm it anymore. Maryland especially makes it much better, but definitely at least wait a year to work on them and get those other core teams first. And now we have our penultimate team in this Dr. Aphra. I think this is a very solid team, but as a team that requires 4 Relic 5 characters to unlock, I think it doesn't take priority over like Star Killer or even like Inquisitors. I think those are more valuable to get, and those aren't even like super early priorities for the first tier, but if you wanted to do them in the first tier, more power to you. Darth Vader, I mean, doesn't always go here. Sometimes I just run with Imperial Probe Droid, which is actually kind of a difficult unlock for newer players. It's like you need to spend get 2 currency to get him, so that's a longer farm. V2, if it's a very competing interest for the General Grievous team. The only for sure characters you have in there are BT1 000, and that's great for 3v3, but then in 5v5, there's tougher choices to make. She can beat Jabba with some luck, and then with her Datacron right now, it's pretty easy, but that's not a permanent state of affairs, so it's not something we want to consider. And if you're putting relics in, like a few relics into characters, I think you want to, I don't know, put it into a team. Like you could put 1 Relic 5 character on 4 different teams and make a huge difference. I don't know, I'm not going to rattle off examples right now because I have other videos for that, but like I think spreading out a few Relic 5s across multiple teams is better than going for a character like Aphra or even like Galactic Legend too early, because like all those resources on like the undesirable requirements is very taxing, very draining on new players, and all the characters required for her require a lot of Chirotex too, so it's a pretty steep price of admission. So don't work on Aphra for at least a year. And the last one that I know I'm gonna get a lot of flack for, and maybe you can convince me, maybe I'm just out of place here or like off base here, but the standard Imperial Trooper team led by Veers with Admiral Piet and Dark Trooper is extremely compelling if you're going for an executive farm early. You have to have Piet at higher relics, Relic 8 actually. Veers you have to have in relics. Moff Gideon's an early game character. Dark Troopers accessible early. But I don't think you need to do them anymore. One of the most compelling arguments to farm them aside from like executive requirements is that they are good in the assault battles, and there's 2 of them. There's one that requires Empire and one that requires Imperial Troopers. But for the Empire one, you can get pretty far with a very well-developed Emperor Palpatine team, especially with newer characters like Mara Jade, and you can even have Gideon in there. I mean, I think Gideon is a great plug-and-play Empire character. And then for the Rebel Roundup, you can use Bosk Bounty Hunters if you have them built up pretty well. Grief and Mando definitely can help with that. So you can use those for a while, and then I think you only when you're really pushing for challenge tier 3 and maybe 2, maybe you won't be able to get 2 with those other teams. When you're really pushing for challenge tier 3 in those assault battles, I think that's more of the time to start working on the Admiral Piet team and maybe your Executor. But you can get away with Negotiator is such a strong fleet. Like, I don't know if you need to go for Executor first anymore, because it's just a really steep investment. I mean, the Bounty Hunters are great, and you know, Darth Vader's nice, he's in there, but it's a lot of ships to farm. Farming a ton of extra ships is a real big strain on an early account, especially some ships that you might not be using. So I don't know. That's going to be my experiment for 2024. It's just to see how early accounts can do without Piet. And another reason is these are all like just hard node energy farms. I mean, Moff Gideon has Cantina energy, but they don't have spread out resources pouring into them. So that's why I don't think it's as good anymore for a beginner team. Can't talk beginner team. Just because, I don't know, stretching out your energy, and Phoenix is so compelling now, and that leads so well into a Palpatine, Thrawn, a Darth Vader team, which can be your Dark Side Empire team. So, just my opinion. We'll see how it plays out. Love to hear the dissension down below. That's it for this one. Just some pretty solid teams that you don't need to really rush as a newer player. There's plenty of other good teams, which will come out in my free-to-play farming guide soon. If you're watching this after or like in 2024, you can just hop on over and go see it. But yeah, get these teams eventually for sure. And if you have a specific reason to fit them in, like by all means. I mean, everyone's farming plan is different, but hopefully this just helps you re-solidify your priorities in 2024. And if you're a newer player, just start the game off on the right foot. Thanks so much, guys, for watching. Don't forget to like and sub and all that stuff, and I'll see you next year.